My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 46 years old and I live in a small town outside of Grants Pass, Oregon. I work as a regional maintenance supervisor for a utility company, which mostly means long solo drives, inspections, and a lot of time being alone in places most people don't spend much time thinking about. What I'm going to describe didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly over several months in a way that didn't feel alarming at first. Looking back, that gradual pace is probably why I didn't stop it earlier, or question it more seriously while it was happening. Part of my territory includes a stretch of old access roads that run alongside decommissioned power corridors in the Rogue River, Siskiyou National Forest. These roads aren't marked for public use anymore, but they're still legally accessible for maintenance crews. Most of the time they're empty. Occasionally you'll see a hunter during the season, or someone camping farther off the main road. In late spring of 2018, I was assigned to do weekly inspections of a relay station that sat about 11 miles from the nearest paved road. It was a routine assignment. I'd drive out every Tuesday morning, check the equipment, log the readings, and head back before noon. The first time I noticed anything unusual was during my third week on the route. About halfway down the access road, there's a pullout where I usually stop to make a call and check my notes. That morning there was a pickup truck parked there. It was an older model, late 90s maybe, dark green with no company markings. That wasn't especially strange, but what stood out was that no one was around it. No tent. No person. Just the truck, parked neatly inside the pullout, engine cold. I assumed it belonged to a hunter or someone hiking nearby. I didn't think much of it and continued on. The following week, the truck was there again. Same spot. Same orientation. Still no one visible. I remember slowing down and looking more carefully that time. The windows were tinted and I couldn't see inside clearly. There were no license plates on the front or back, which struck me as odd but not unheard of in rural areas. I made a mental note of it and moved on. By the fourth week, I started to feel mildly uneasy about it. The truck was still there. Same position. No signs of activity. No tire tracks indicating it had moved recently. The dust on the windshield looked undisturbed. That was the first time I stopped my vehicle and got out. I walked around the truck slowly, keeping a reasonable distance. There was no visible damage. The doors were locked. Through the side window, I could see a bench seat and what looked like a folded tarp on the floor. No personal items. No trash. No smell. It looked less like someone's camp vehicle and more like something that had been deliberately placed there. Still, there was nothing illegal about a parked truck. I told myself I was overthinking it and continued my inspection. Over the next 2 months, the pattern continued. Every Tuesday the truck was there. It never moved. It never changed. No one ever appeared nearby. I mentioned it casually to my supervisor during a weekly check-in. He said there were sometimes surveyors or forestry contractors in the area and not to worry about it unless it was blocking access or appeared abandoned. Technically, it wasn't abandoned. It just wasn't doing anything. Around mid-July, something changed. As I drove past the pullout that morning, I noticed the driver's side door was open. I stopped immediately. The door was wide open, but the interior looked exactly the same. No one was around. I waited in my truck for several minutes, scanning the tree line, listening. It was quiet in that deep forest way where sound feels absorbed rather than absent. Eventually, I got out and approached again. The door hadn't been forced. There was no sign of a struggle or damage. It was just open. Inside, the tarp was gone. That was it. That was the only difference. I closed the door, more out of instinct than anything else, and returned to my vehicle. I finished my inspection quickly that day and left earlier than usual. The next week, the truck was gone. The pullout was empty. No tire marks. No sign it had ever been there. I felt relieved more than confused. I assumed whoever owned it had finally moved on. 2 weeks later, the truck was back. Same spot. Same position. Doors closed. This time, there was a piece of white paper tucked under the windshield wiper. I did not get out of my vehicle immediately. I sat there for a long time, engine running, trying to decide if this was something I needed to report or if I was just letting my imagination get ahead of me. Eventually, I walked over. The paper was blank. Completely blank. No writing. No markings. Just a clean sheet, folded once. I left it there and finished my work. That was my last week on that route. The assignment was reassigned shortly after due to staffing changes. I never saw the truck again. Sometimes I think about how consistent it was. How precise. How quiet. I still drive those roads occasionally, but I don't stop at that pullout anymore. There's no official reason for that. It just doesn't feel like a place that needs my attention. My name is Robert Hayes. I am 52 years old and I've spent most of my adult life working as a long-haul delivery driver based out of Amarillo, Texas. For over 20 years, my route stayed mostly the same. West Texas, eastern New Mexico, southern Colorado. A lot of highway. A lot of repetition. In 2020, during a period when several drivers were out, I was temporarily assigned a night route that ran through a rural stretch of eastern New Mexico, connecting smaller distribution points that didn't justify daytime traffic. The route itself wasn't difficult. Long straight highways, sparse towns, minimal traffic, the kind of driving that becomes automatic after a while. About an hour into the drive, there was a rest stop I started using regularly. It wasn't much more than a gravel lot with 2 portable toilets and a covered picnic table. No lighting other than what came from the highway. The first few nights it was empty. Then one night there was a man sitting at the picnic table. He was facing away from the road, sitting very still. I remember noticing how upright his posture was. He didn't react to my truck pulling in. No glance. No movement. I used the restroom, got back in my truck and left. The next night he was there again. Same position. Same stillness. I assumed he was a local or maybe someone without a car resting during the cooler hours. There was nothing threatening about him. He was just there. Over the next several weeks, I saw him almost every night. He never acknowledged me. Never looked up. Never changed position. I started paying closer attention to details. He wore the same clothes every time. A light jacket, jeans, boots, no hat, no bag. One night, out of simple curiosity, I said hello as I walked past. He didn't respond. I stopped and waited for a moment, but there was still nothing. I could see his shoulders rising and falling slightly, which told me he was breathing. After that, I didn't say anything else. I left it at that. One night in early October, the rest stop was empty. I noticed it right away, but I didn't think much of it. People move on. The following night he was back. This time he was sitting on the opposite side of the picnic table, still facing away from the road. I didn't stop that night. I drove past without pulling in. A few nights later, I needed to stop again. The man was there. As I parked, he stood up. That was the first time I had seen him move. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, facing the desert, his hands at his sides. I stayed in my truck and waited until he sat back down. After that, I stopped using that rest area. A few weeks later, my route changed again and I never went back. Months later, I asked another driver about that rest stop. He said he had never seen anyone there. That's all I have. There's no explanation. Just a pattern that ended when I stepped out of it. My name is Robert Hayes. I am 52 years old and I've worked as a long-haul delivery driver for most of my adult life. I'm based out of Amarillo, Texas, but my routes have taken me across a good portion of the Southwest over the years. I've always preferred overnight driving. Less traffic. Fewer distractions. The roads feel more predictable when most people are asleep. What I'm about to describe happened in 2020, during a period when schedules were inconsistent and a lot of regular drivers were temporarily out. I was assigned a night route that wasn't part of my usual rotation, running through eastern New Mexico and connecting a series of smaller distribution points that didn't get much daytime traffic. The route itself wasn't difficult. Long stretches of 2-lane highway, sparse towns, open land on both sides of the road for miles at a time. It was the kind of driving that encourages routine. You stop at the same places at the same times without really thinking about it. About an hour and a half into the drive, there was a rest stop I started using regularly. Calling it a rest stop might be generous. It was a gravel pull-off set back from the highway, with 2 portable toilets, a metal picnic table, and a small roof structure bolted into concrete. There were no vending machines, no lighting other than whatever your headlights provided, and no signage beyond a faded highway marker. The first few nights I used it, the place was empty. I'd pull in, park with the cab facing the road, stretch my legs, use the restroom, and get back on the highway. I usually spent no more than 5 minutes there. It was just enough to break up the drive. On the 4th night, there was someone there. I noticed him as soon as my headlights swept across the lot. He was sitting at the picnic table under the roof, facing away from the highway. His back was straight, hands resting on the table, feet flat on the ground. He didn't move when I pulled in. No glance. No shift in posture. I remember pausing for a moment before getting out of the truck. mostly because I wasn't expecting anyone to be there at that hour. It was close to 2 a.m. Still, there was nothing about him that suggested danger. I got out, walked past him toward the portable toilets, and did what I needed to do. He didn't move the entire time. When I walked back to my truck, I looked at him again. Same position. Same stillness. I could hear the wind moving through the scrub brush beyond the lot, but nothing else. I got back in my truck and left. The next night he was there again. Same table. Same seat. Same orientation, facing away from the road. I told myself he was probably a local. Maybe someone without reliable transportation who used the rest stop as a place to sit during the cooler hours of the night. Eastern New Mexico can still be warm late into the evening, even outside of summer. Over the next week, I saw him every night. He never arrived or left while I was there. He was simply present when I pulled in and still present when I drove away. His clothing didn't change. A light-colored jacket, jeans, work boots, no visible bag or belongings. I started paying attention to small details without really intending to. The way his shoulders stayed level. The way his head never turned. The fact that he didn't seem to react to noise. Diesel engines aren't quiet, especially at close range. One night, I deliberately shut off my engine when I parked, just to see if the change in sound would make a difference. It didn't. He didn't move. That was the first time I felt something I would describe as mild unease. Not fear. Just a sense that something about the situation didn't line up with my expectations. Still, I continued stopping there. Habit is a strong thing when you drive for a living. About 2 weeks into seeing him regularly, I decided to acknowledge him. Not out of concern, but out of curiosity. As I walked past the picnic table, I said hello. Just a simple evening. He didn't respond. I stopped a few steps past him and waited. I wasn't trying to provoke anything. I just stood there listening. He remained still. His breathing was visible in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders, but that was the only movement. After a few seconds, I continued on. I didn't speak to him again after that. The rest stop became part of my mental checklist. He was either there or he wasn't. Except for a long time he always was. Then one night in early October, the lot was empty. No man. No vehicle. Nothing. I noticed immediately. I slowed down as I pulled in, scanning the area with my headlights. The table was empty. The rest of the lot looked unchanged. I used the restroom and left without thinking much more about it. People don't stay in one place forever. The following night he was back. This time he was sitting on the opposite side of the picnic table. It was a small change, but it stood out. He was still facing away from the road, but now his back was closer to the highway than before. I didn't get out of the truck that night. I stayed parked for a moment, engine running, watching him through the windshield. He didn't move. After a minute or two, I pulled back onto the highway and continued driving. Over the next few nights, I stopped avoiding the rest area, but I didn't linger. Each time he was there. Always seated. Always facing away. Then one night as I pulled in, he stood up. It happened slowly. No sudden movement. He simply rose from the bench and stood at the edge of the covered area, still facing the desert beyond the lot. I stayed in my truck. He didn't turn around. He didn't approach. He just stood there, hands at his sides. After about 30 seconds, he sat back down. I left without getting out. That was the last night I used that rest stop. From then on, I drove an extra 40 minutes before stopping anywhere. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. I just didn't feel the need to pull in there anymore. A few weeks later, my assignment changed again. I was moved back to my usual routes and I didn't pass through that area anymore. Months later, I mentioned the rest stop to another driver in casual conversation. I asked if he'd ever seen anyone hanging around there at night. He said no. He said the place was always empty. I didn't press the issue. I don't think about it often, but when I do, what stands out isn't anything dramatic. It's the consistency, the repetition, the way the situation never escalated, never resolved, and never explained itself. It was just there until it wasn't, and that was enough to change my routine. My name is Daniel. I am 39 years old, and at the time this happened, I was working as a seasonal groundskeeper for a state park in northern Maine, outside a small town near Millinocket. I took the job in early 2019. I'd done similar work before. Trail maintenance, campground checks, basic upkeep. It was quiet work, mostly solitary, and that suited me. I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I just needed steady employment for a few months. The park covered a large area of forest and lakefront. Most visitors stayed close to the main campground near the ranger station, but there was a smaller, more remote campground about 7 miles deeper into the park. That was where I spent most of my time. The remote campground had 12 sites arranged in a loop. No hookups. No permanent staff presence. Visitors were expected to check in at the main station before driving out. Because of the distance, compliance wasn't perfect, but usually it wasn't an issue. My daily routine was consistent. I'd arrive mid-morning, clear trails, check fire pits, collect trash, and log occupied sites. In the evening, just before dusk, I'd do a final drive-through to make sure everything was in order. About 2 weeks into the season, I noticed a tent at the far end of the loop. It was a small dome tent, gray or tan, set up neatly on one of the pads. No vehicle nearby. No fire ring in use. No personal items outside. It looked like someone who knew what they were doing had set it up quickly and efficiently. I checked the log. No one had checked in for that site. That wasn't unheard of. Sometimes people arrived late and planned to check in the next morning. I made a note and moved on. The next day the tent was still there. Still no vehicle. Still no fire. No trash. No signs of activity. I assumed the camper was out hiking or fishing. The area had several trails and good access to the water. By the third day I started paying closer attention. The tent never changed. The door was always zipped closed. The guy lines were taut. The ground around it showed no new footprints. If someone was staying there, they were doing so with minimal impact. I left a standard notice on the picnic table, reminding the camper to check in at the ranger station. When I came back the next evening, the notice was gone. The tent remained. This continued for over a week. Each day, no vehicle. No visible person. Each evening, the tent was exactly as it had been before. I mentioned it to another groundskeeper. He said if the notice was being removed, someone was probably around and to keep an eye on it. One evening, as part of my final check, I stopped my truck and got out near the site. I didn't approach the tent directly. I just stood near the edge of the pad and called out. "Park staff," I said. "Just checking in." There was no response. I waited longer than I usually would have. The woods were quiet in that late evening way, when the day sounds fade but the night hasn't fully started yet. I called out again. Still nothing. I didn't touch the tent. That wasn't allowed unless there was an emergency. I logged the site again and left. The following morning the tent was still there. At that point, it had been present for nearly 2 weeks without any confirmed sighting of a camper. The ranger station contacted me and asked for more detail. I explained the situation. They told me to continue monitoring and to notify them if anything changed. Nothing changed. The tent remained through rain, through cool nights, through several days where the campground was otherwise completely empty. Then one afternoon, after a particularly heavy rainstorm, I noticed something new. The tent was completely dry. The ground around it was wet. The picnic table was wet. The fire ring had water pooled inside it. But the tent fabric looked dry. Not just untouched by rain, dry as if it had been packed away recently and set back up. That was the first time I felt unsettled. A few days later, I returned for my evening check and found the tent gone. No warning. No gradual change. Just gone. What stood out wasn't the absence, but the lack of evidence. The ground where it had been was smooth. No compressed soil. No cleared debris. No sign that a tent had been there for weeks. It looked like an unused site. I reported it. The ranger station closed the log. The rest of the season passed without incident. I didn't think much about it until the following year, when I returned for another seasonal contract. On my first week back, during a routine drive-through, I passed the same site. There was a tent there. Same size. Same color. Same placement. No vehicle. No fire. No sound. I stopped my truck, looked at it for a long time, and then continued driving. I didn't log it that day. The next day it was gone. I never saw it again. I still work park jobs from time to time. I follow procedures carefully. I document what I'm supposed to document. But I've learned that not everything leaves the kind of evidence you expect. Some things are present without ever really arriving and gone without ever clearly leaving. That's all this was. Just something that happened.